Long before geologists measured the scar above the Columbia River, people living along its banks preserved the memory of a crossing that should not have existed. They said there had once been a place where travelers could move from one side of the Columbia to the other without getting their feet wet. Then the ground shook. Rock came down from the mountains. The crossing collapsed, the river rose behind it, and violent rapids appeared where calm water had once flowed. For generations, versions of that account circulated among the Klickitat and other peoples of the Columbia River. Modern researchers initially treated the story as a legend. Then they examined Table Mountain on the Washington side of the Columbia River Gorge. An enormous portion of the slope was missing. Below it lay more than 5 square miles of displaced rock and soil. The debris had traveled across the valley, buried the old river channel, forced the Columbia south, and created a natural dam large enough for people to walk over. In 2022, scientists dated trees killed by the event. The results placed the landslide between 1421 and 1455. The oral history and the physical evidence were describing the same century. So what really collapsed into the Columbia River? Was the Bridge of the Gods an enormous arch of stone, as later paintings imagined? Or did the oldest stories preserve something even more violent, a mountain falling across one of the largest rivers in North America? The Columbia River Gorge cuts through the Cascade Range between present-day Oregon and Washington. Today, highways, railroad tracks, power lines, dams, towns, and a steel bridge occupy the narrow corridor. But long before those structures appeared, the Columbia was already one of the most important human routes in western North America. Communities traveled along it, fished from its banks, gathered at major rapids, exchanged food and tools, and maintained relationships extending hundreds of miles through the Columbia Basin. Salmon moved through the river in immense seasonal runs. The places where those fish became concentrated supported villages, trade centers, ceremonies, and generations of human life. The river was not a boundary separating isolated peoples. It was a road, a provider, and a living center of the region. That is why any event capable of stopping it would have been impossible to forget. The title of this investigation names the Klickitat because a well-known version of the Bridge of the Gods account has long been attributed to Klickitat tradition. But the story belongs to a wider landscape. Klickitat, Wasco, Wishram, Cascades, Chinookan, Yakima, and other Columbia River peoples preserved accounts involving a great crossing, a blockage of the river, rising water, and the later formation of dangerous rapids. The names and spiritual figures vary. The central transformation remains remarkably stable. There was once a way across the river. Something destroyed it, and the Columbia changed afterward. That shared core matters more than forcing every version into one standardized story. Oral traditions do not move through history like identical printed pages. They remain connected to families, languages, communities, and particular locations. Two storytellers may preserve different spiritual explanations while still remembering the same physical event. Before we continue, consider subscribing if you come here for the moments when ancestral memory, forgotten records, and physical evidence begin describing the same landscape. Because the Bridge of the Gods presents one of the clearest examples in this entire series. The river itself still carries the consequences of what happened. One early version of the oral history was summarized in direct physical terms. People could once cross the Columbia without getting their feet wet. The river had been blocked. Water rose far above its previous level. Eventually, the Columbia cut a path through the obstruction, and the rapids known as the Cascades appeared. That account contains no measurements, geological terminology, or calendar date. It does not need them. It preserves the sequence. A barrier crossed the river. A lake formed behind it. The water broke through. Rocks left in the channel created violent rapids. That is almost exactly the sequence reconstructed by modern geology. Another version is far more dramatic. It tells of the Great Spirit and two powerful sons named Pato and Y East. Pato lived north of the Columbia. Y East lived south of it. A great bridge was created so the family and the peoples of the region could cross between the two sides. The brothers then became rivals for the affection of a woman named Luwit. Their dispute grew into a battle large enough to disturb the entire landscape. They threw fire and stone. The earth shook, forests were destroyed, villages were buried, and the Great Crossing fell into the Columbia River. As punishment, the figures were transformed into mountains. Pato became Mount Adams, East became Mount Hood, Lewitt became Mount St. Helens. The mountains surrounding the Columbia Gorge became the permanent remains of the conflict. It is a powerful account. It is also one we must handle carefully. The popular Pato, East, and Lewitt narrative exists in several forms, and parts of the version most Americans recognize were shaped by 19th and early 20th century writers. Frederick Homer Balch used Columbia River traditions as the foundation of his 1890 novel, The Bridge of the Gods. Other writers turned regional accounts into poems and romantic stories for non-native audiences. Those publications helped preserve public awareness of the Bridge of the Gods. They also altered, combined, and dramatized Indigenous material. The popular version should therefore not be treated as a word-for-word transcript carried unchanged from the 15th century. It is a meeting point between native memory, later storytelling, and American literature. But removing the romantic additions does not make the mystery disappear. The oldest physical core remains. A crossing once existed. People remembered moving over it. It was destroyed. The Columbia rose behind the obstruction, and rapids appeared after the water cut through. Modern geology confirms that an event capable of producing every one of those changes occurred at the precise location associated with the story. The source was Table Mountain. It rises above the Washington side of the Columbia River Gorge, across from present-day Oregon. Today, the mountain does not have the smooth shape we might expect from an undisturbed slope. A huge section of its southern face is missing. The exposed cliffs form the head of what geologists call the Cascade Landslide Complex, a broad zone containing evidence of repeated slope failures over thousands of years. The Bonneville Landslide was one of the largest and most recent of those events. It was not a small rockfall. It was a rockslide debris avalanche covering approximately 15.5 square kilometers. Material descended about 1,000 meters from the northern wall of the gorge and traveled across the valley below. Evidence suggests portions of the slide may have moved at tens of feet per second. Anyone in its path would have had almost no chance to escape. Imagine the beginning. A section of mountainside several miles across starts to move. At first, there may have been cracking, falling trees, dust, and isolated blocks breaking loose. Then the deeper mass fails. Forested ground begins sliding over weakened layers beneath it. Trees remain upright for a few moments while the land carrying their roots accelerates downslope. Rock breaks apart. Entire sections of slope rotate, collide, and fragment. The moving mass reaches the bottom of the gorge and continues across the Columbia. The sound would have been overwhelming. Rock grinding against rock, trees breaking, water displaced from the river, air pushed ahead of the debris. The popular story says the anger of Pato and East shook the earth and sent rocks across the country. A witness without geological language would not have seen a controlled sequence of slope failure and debris transport. They would have seen a mountain moving. The geology of the gorge made such a collapse possible. The region contains thick layers of volcanic rock produced by ancient eruptions millions of years ago. Between some of those harder layers lie weaker volcanic sediments and deeply weathered, clay-rich material. Water can enter fractures and reduce the stability of the slope. Older landslide deposits can also be reactivated, meaning part of the mountain may move along surfaces that failed before. The western Columbia Gorge contains many such landslides, including some that remain active. The precise trigger of the Bonneville landslide is still unknown. Heavy rain could have contributed. An earthquake may have started the final movement. The new dating rules out the famous Cascadia earthquake of 1700 because the slide happened centuries earlier. It does not eliminate an older subduction zone earthquake or a local earthquake as a possible trigger. The mountain tells us how it failed. It has not told us what moved first. When the debris reached the Columbia, it completely blocked the river. The older channel had run closer to the Washington side of the gorge. The slide buried it and forced the eventual river course toward Oregon. In places, the debris may have reached roughly 400 feet in thickness. More than 5 square miles of broken mountain occupied the valley. The Columbia could no longer continue west toward the Pacific. For a time, one of the largest rivers on the continent stopped. That statement is easy to read and difficult to picture. The Columbia drains an enormous region. Water from rivers and snowmelt continued arriving from the east even after the channel was blocked. The flow had nowhere to go. A lake began forming behind the landslide. Water backed into valleys, covered low ground, and drowned forests that had stood above the old shoreline. Estimates suggest the impounded lake may have become roughly 300 feet deep near the obstruction and extended as far as Wallula Gap, approximately 170 miles upstream. The exact maximum level and duration remain uncertain. The natural dam changed constantly as water rose against it, seeped through it, and began finding roots around its edges. But even a temporary lake of that scale would have transformed the human geography of the river. Fishing places disappeared underwater. Beaches, trails, camps, and low settlements would have been flooded. Canoe routes changed. Communities upstream could no longer use the river as they had before. The landslide did not need to strike a village directly to disrupt entire societies. Blocking the Columbia was enough. The popular Pato and Wyeast narrative says villages were buried beneath falling rock. That detail is physically possible, but it should not be presented as an archaeologically confirmed list of settlements. People had lived along the Columbia for thousands of years, and communities were likely present near the affected corridor when the slide occurred. However, the landslide, flooding, erosion, and later construction destroyed or covered much of the archaeological evidence. No excavation has produced a complete named village beneath the main slide deposit that can be tied with certainty to one version of the story. What can be said honestly is still severe. Any camps, houses, fishing places, burial areas, or trails lying in the path of the avalanche would have been buried. Low areas upstream were inundated. When the dam later failed, communities downstream faced another disaster. The physical event created several different zones of destruction, not one. The trees became witnesses. Some were caught directly inside the moving landslide. Others remained standing upstream while the newly formed lake rose around them. Their roots, adapted to land above ordinary river levels, could not survive prolonged flooding. The trees died. For centuries, trunks from the submerged forest remained visible in the Columbia. Early travelers described looking into clear water and seeing upright trees beneath the surface, their branches extending into a river that had not been there when they began growing. Lewis and Clark also noted tree stumps and the unusual geography surrounding the Cascades. The drowned forest provided a physical clue that the water level had changed suddenly. But for a long time, researchers could not determine exactly when the trees had died. Scientists eventually studied 3 of them. One tree had been uprooted and buried by the landslide itself. 2 others had been killed by rising water upstream. Researchers compared the growth rings and demonstrated that all 3 trees died during the same year. They then performed 9 radiocarbon analyses on carefully selected samples. The combined result placed the deaths, and therefore the Bonneville Landslide, between 1421 and 1455, with a high level of statistical confidence. The date is extraordinary for one reason. It makes the event recent enough to have affected communities whose descendants continued living throughout the Columbia Basin into the historical period. This was not a transformation from some remote geological age before human habitation. People were there. The landslide entered living memory. Once the lake rose high enough, water began overtopping the natural dam. A river as powerful as the Columbia does not remain blocked forever by loose debris. Water searched for the lowest point, flowed over it, and began cutting downward. At first, the new channel may have been narrow. Then erosion accelerated. Mud, gravel, trees, and boulders were carried from the barrier. The channel widened and deepened as more water escaped from the lake behind it. At some stage, the partial breach produced an enormous downstream flood. One United States Geological Survey reconstruction estimated a flow near 7,700,000 cubic feet per second, roughly 6 times greater than the largest weather-driven flood measured on the river during the previous century and a half. The water carried the evidence of the failed dam toward the Pacific. The dam did not disappear completely. The river removed smaller material more easily than the largest rocks. Enormous blocks remained in the channel, narrowing and roughening the flow. Those remnants became the Cascades of the Columbia. Near the main rapid, the river dropped more than 20 feet across approximately 600 yards. It then continued descending through additional rapids over several miles. For indigenous canoe travelers, the Cascades became a difficult and dangerous passage. For later explorers and settlers, they became a major obstacle requiring portage. Lewis and Clark mapped the feature as the Great Chute. The rapids were not a separate mystery. They were what remained after the Bridge of the Gods broke open. The new choke point also created opportunities. Salmon moving upstream became concentrated in the narrowed, turbulent water. Cascades and Chinookan communities established important fishing places near the rapids. Travelers carrying goods around the obstructions supported a portage economy. The disaster that destroyed one river landscape eventually produced another center of life, trade, and political importance. That is how human relationships with catastrophic events often work. The land does not return to what it was. People learn how to live with what it became. By the 19th century, the Cascades were one of the most difficult points for navigation on the lower Columbia. Boats could not simply pass through safely. Cargo and passengers were moved around the rapids, first through indigenous trails and later through roads, railways, canals, and locks. A mountain collapse in the 15th century continued shaping economics and transportation hundreds of years later. In 1926, a steel structure opened between Cascade Locks, Oregon, and Stevenson, Washington. It was named the Bridge of the Gods. The modern bridge is approximately 1,858 feet long. It stands near the place where the Bonneville Landslide once blocked the river, although it does not reproduce the shape or scale of the original land crossing. 12 years later, Bonneville Dam raised the water level and drowned the old Cascade Rapids. The violent remnant of the landslide disappeared beneath the reservoir. A modern traveler can now cross the river by car without seeing the rapids that explained the old story. But the landslide itself remains visible. Look toward Table Mountain. The missing face of the slope is still there. Look at the constriction near Bonneville Dam. Part of the structure stands against the edge of the ancient slide. The event has not vanished. Later artists often imagined an enormous stone arch spanning the Columbia, with water flowing peacefully through an open space beneath it. That image is memorable. It is also geologically unlikely. The Bonneville Landslide initially formed a dam, not a delicate arch. Rock and soil filled the valley and stopped the river. People could have crossed because solid debris extended from one side of the gorge to the other. In that functional sense, it was a bridge. It allowed dry passage over a place previously crossed by canoe. Today, cars cross the modern Bridge of the Gods in a matter of minutes. Most drivers never look toward the scar on Table Mountain. They do not see the old channel buried beneath the Washington side of the gorge. They do not see the drowned forest now hidden by the reservoir. They cross above the same river where another bridge existed nearly 6 centuries earlier. Not a constructed span, and probably not a perfect arch, but a fallen section of mountain powerful enough to stop the Columbia. The Klickitat tradition remembered what it allowed people to do. The geology reveals what it was made of, and the trees tell us when it happened. Do you think the Bridge of the Gods account preserved a direct human memory of the Bonneville landslide, or did later generations connect an older spiritual story with the scar they saw in the landscape? Share your interpretation in the comments. Subscribe for more investigations where ancestral memory, forgotten records, and physical evidence finally meet. Because the bridge was not imaginary. We may simply have been imagining the wrong kind.